Today on the channel, motoring maverick Rich Duisberg talks about the forgotten F1 drivers who prove that sometimes the back of the grid is the most interesting place to be, if you can make it that far. And if you've enjoyed today's video, please consider checking out one of my others that we've made together or buying one of his books, Confessions from Quality Control, Nothing Handles Like a Rental Car, and Looking for the Real Weasel, the story of Roy James, one of the great train robbers. All available to purchase on Amazon with links below.
Sorry, you're starting with a hello I'm. No, I'm starting with a hello I'm.
Yeah.
I've cocked it up before I've even started. Hello, I'm Rich Duisberg. I've been fortunate enough to appear on a couple of films previously for James, the JAYEMM channel. I'm on a hunt to find what I think is the worst ever driver in F1 history. Now, this is a topic that kind of stimulates a lot of passions and emotions from people, and I don't profess to be an F1 expert, but I absolutely love the weird, the wonderful, the no-hopers, the blaggers, and the bullshitters. Can you beat that? You can beat that. So this is my list of approximately 22 hopeless people. Now, my intention ultimately is maybe to write a book, maybe to meet some of these people or to get a bit closer to it, because above all, I love the fact that some fairly mediocre drivers have somehow wangled their way into the top echelons of motorsport with very little skill, and I can definitely relate to that. So here's my list. First driver on my list. Now, these aren't in any particular order, by the way. When I started to do my research, it was a little bit, do I go through this chronologically or by team or by nationality or even just by data? Because you can judge a driver by their data, but it kind of takes the colour and the fun out of it. And F1 is just entertainment after all. So my first driver, who I think is one of the worst drivers ever in F1, is a chap called Jorge Bagration E.D. Mukrani. Now, I've almost certainly pronounced that wrong, and Georgians and Spaniards are probably screaming at the screen right now, because Jorge, I'm going to call him that, he was a member of the aristocracy in Georgia. And when communism took over in Georgia, like many Eastern European countries, they were dispersed throughout Europe. So the Mukrani family ended up in Italy and ended up in Spain. Now, as with a lot of very rich people with time on their hands, he found his way into motorsport. So Jorge at first got into touring cars, which was pretty good, and then into hill climbs, which were really popular back in his time, and his time is 1974 in this instance. And by the time the 74 Spanish Grand Prix came around at Jarama, he decided to try and get a ticket. Now, what makes this a bit unusual is that he really wasn't anywhere near good enough. Now, he isn't unique in that sense, in that everybody else in here perhaps isn't that good. But because he was a royal, and because he was married to a Spanish lady, he had the Spanish media behind him. So he applied to the Spanish Motorsport Authority for a license. He somehow got some notional sponsorship, and he bought a Surtees TS16. Now, a Surtees F1 car at that era, it was an okay car, right? And it's fair to say that poor drivers don't jump straight into the hottest cars, so you sometimes end up with average drivers and average cars. So I'm going to blame the car slightly for him here. So he submitted all of his paperwork. It all went into the Spanish authorities, and just 2 days before the race, the guy organising the race for the Spanish FIA, or the equivalent at the time, got fired under suspicious circumstances. And this guy so had the hump that he cleared his desk of all the entry papers and binned the lot. So there's no record of who should be in the race or what this procedure should be or anything. And of course, as part of that, Jorge's papers also went missing. Now, what put him at a disadvantage, of course, is a new organiser came in and did it by the book. And when you do it by the book, there's no way this guy should be allowed anywhere near a Formula One race. So despite his protestations and a lot of noise and a lot of fan support, he never even made it to the circuit. So he applied for a race, he bought quite an expensive car, he put his papers in, he notionally had an entry, but he never hit the track. And that's why I think he's probably one of the least successful F1 drivers ever. Statistically, Claudio Langes, the Italian Claudio Langes, is probably the worst Formula One driver ever. Now, if you're a fan of his, feel free to slate me and my wonky face and bad moustache in the comments, no problem. But statistically, it's hard to argue that if you turn up consecutively 16 times you don't pass qualifying, then basically you're not a great driver. in that particular era, looking back at the late 80s, early 90s, sometimes there were so many teams entering that there were more applicants than there were slots on the grid. So what would happen is, prior to qualifying, you'd have pre-qualifying, which was a way of sorting out a couple of the back markers who were arguing over that very prestigious and hallowed last slot on the grid to qualify in order to race. Claudio Langer's never even got that far. 16 times on the bounce he turned up, 16 times he didn't pass qualifying. Now, he was actually pretty good in karting and Formula 3000, which was kind of a distant forebear of F2. So it wasn't that he couldn't drive. I think it's probably fair to say that his Eurobrun team were pretty hopeless. And this is a classic example of a very mediocre driver ending up in a very mediocre car. What I don't understand with Claudio Langer's is he was a poor driver, and I'm uncomfortable saying that because they're all better than me and probably better than James, who's not in a position to argue the toss from behind the camera. But I don't see what sponsorship he brought either. So it wasn't even like he had the money to get the drive. So I think he just winged it. So in '89, I believe it was, Eurobrun had one car. They could only afford to run one car, and for whatever mental financial reasons, they decided to run two cars in 1990. Whether this is like a risk mitigation strategy, sharing spares or what, I don't know. But they turned up at the Canadian Grand Prix, I think it was in 1990. And I'm aware, by the way, there's going to be quite a few errors in this film, so feel free to put me straight. This is about my research after all. And they would have been fined if they didn't race. So they simply turned up and then practiced and then gave up. And they couldn't even afford to travel to Japan in 1990. And that was, I think, the end of the team. And it was the end of Claudio Langer's. And like many others that appear in this film, there's no record of him now. I don't know where he is. So he might turn up randomly at some event and punch me in the chops for having been rude about his racing career, or he might pat me on the back and correct me for some of the mistakes that I've made. But I think it's great that he appeared in F1. I don't think many people will remember him as being a great F1 driver. That's the story of Claudio Langer's. Next on the list is Johnny Carwash. Johnny Carwash is perhaps better and more respectfully known as Giovanni Lavacci, a Sicilian whose name means something like car wash in Italian. I don't know. He arrived at the Pacific team in 1995 and he entered 4 races and didn't finish any of them. He had a gearbox issue and a couple of other mechanical maladies, which was fairly unfortunate. Pacific were a bad team, but they weren't that bad a team, so 4 did not finish is kind of embarrassing, but it's not that bad. Next year, for whatever reason, he went to Minardi and his record really went down the pan then. Now, this is why he appears on this theoretical list, because Minardi weren't that bad a team. So in his first race, he was too slow. In his next race in Hungary, he crashed. Then he was too slow in Belgium. And then in his next home race in Italy, he spun off or broke down, I believe it was, after just 6 laps in front of his home fans. So all of this wonderful expectations, we've all seen the tifosi and the passion that Italian fans have behind Italian drivers, Italian cars. And he fluffed it. He does have his own website, which you may care to check out. It's one of those very early websites that you wouldn't believe is still working. His favourite food is pasta. Now, isn't that a fun fact, viewers? And his favourite drink is tonic water. There you go. That's Johnny Carwash, and that's why it's on the list. Let's talk about Stig. So Stig in this instance is Perry McCarthy, who Top Gear fans will probably know was the original Black Stig, I think he's known as. And he has had a very long motoring career. Now, I absolutely implore you, after you've watched this video in full, don't be jumping off here, is to go and buy a copy of his book, which is called Down and Out in Formula One. And it tells the story of how a fairly ordinary bloke from Essex begged, borrowed, I won't say stole, but wangled sponsorship just to stay in racing. And it got so tough at one stage, I think he remortgaged his house a couple of times. He was perilously close to financial ruin as an ordinary kind of a chap just to stay racing. And of course, his ultimate aim was to be an F1, same as everybody else on this list. What I really like is his chutzpah. Now, he did a couple of amazingly crazy things in order to get sponsorship racing. Now, this is before he turned up at Andrea Forti, and this is kind of pre-internet. What he would do, he would get sponsorship, he would enter a race, inevitably he'd be with a back marker, there'd be some crash, some mechanical problem, and he was actually genuinely a good driver, just never had any money to back him up. So what he would do is he would take the race results from the motoring press and he would take a scalpel and he would cut out his name and cut out the winner's name, switch them over, sellotape them in, photocopy it and send it to his sponsor and cross his fingers that the sponsor would never read the original copy of the article. I think this is outrageous and immoral and therefore bloody brilliant, and that's why he's on the list. Also, something else he did, this comes from his book Down and Out in Formula One. He rang a very, very large company and asked to speak to the managing director, but he did this in the style of James Hunt. I haven't met James Hunt, but I'm going to have a go at his accent. So it's very plummy, very English. Hello, this is James Hunt. I'd like to come to talk to you about sponsorship. And of course, this large company thought, wow, James Hunt, famous F1 driver, world champion, great guy. Yes, I want to come and talk to you. I'm going to bring a young protege of mine called Perry McCarthy, Stig. I'm going to bring him along with me if that's fine. Yeah, of course. So of course, this was all a scam. This was just Perry pretending to be James Hunt. How does James Hunt talk? I don't know. He's not a scouse or anything, is he? So Perry McCarthy turns up at this very large company, walks into reception, says, I'm here to see Mr. Big. And Mr. Big opens the door, takes one look at him, realises he's been rumbled, and he says, Perry, off. And that was the end of his sponsorship with that. Let's talk about his racing career. So in 92, he went to Andrea Forti, and he tells his story far better than me, in that they were putting second-hand parts on his car. They didn't want him in the car because they'd found somebody with real sponsorship, not just pocket money from his business. I mean, he even worked on the oil rigs at one stage. That's how hard he grafted in order to get a seat in F1. And I think his record in F1 is 18 metres, because he didn't pass pre-qualifying or didn't pass pre-qualifying because of the car for 7 races. And the 8th and final race, in practice, he pulled out of the garage, he turned left, and then in his own book he says, I had snap oversteer, but I managed to catch it in the pit lane. 18 metres later, it conked out, and that was the end of his F1 career. He's an after-dinner speaker. Never met him. I've read his book. I think the guy is an absolute genius. And to me, he kind of epitomises the graft and the ingenuity and the madness needed for ordinary people to be able to get into F1. Yeah, watch this video, but more than watch this video, go buy the book, Down and Out in Formula One. Perry's on the list. David Kennedy. David Kennedy is the kind of name that, you know, your auntie's got divorced and she's dating a guy now and she's dating David Kennedy. What does David Kennedy do? Oh, he's in IT in Swindon. You know, I'm sure there are David Kennedys furiously typing the keyboard now, being hugely offended. It's just like a regular kind of name, right? And I hide behind a non-diploma, and I've got quite an ordinary name too. So this is David Kennedy. David Kennedy is now a journalist for the Irish Independent, and he is a commentator for RTE, or the Irish National broadcaster, on all things motorsport. But in 1980, he signed for the Shadow Formula One team. Now, I love Shadow because, number one, they're a bit hopeless, and number two, they have like the coolest logo, cut to logo. Thanks for that. The problem that they had is there was a wrangling between Shadow, Arrows, and a chap called Teddy Yip. And Teddy Yip was the money man behind a lot of this stuff. The problem with Shadow was that their DN11 and DN12 cars couldn't manage the ground effect that was prevalent in F1 at the time. So not only did they come unstuck financially, which was the end of David Kennedy's career, but they also came unstuck physically because they couldn't manage ground effect. Now, his racing record wasn't great, David Kennedy, but apparently he doesn't give a stuff. And I think that's fantastic, and that's why I'm okay pulling his leg a little bit, and I hope if he sees this, he takes it in good faith, because it's great that he got that far. I think he knew his limitations, and let's be honest, if you'd rather be sitting in front of a camera or sitting in a very badly designed, shonky, underfunded F1 car from the 80s, I think this is the safer place to be. So yeah, David Kennedy makes the list. Another Spaniard now, Adrian Campos this time. In his early career, Adrian Campos was a champion remote control model racing driver. This is very unusual, I think, a career path, because everybody can relate to the karting and maybe even a bit of hill climbs and amateur motorsport and single-seaters. That progression into F1 is kind of de rigueur, if I can say that without sounding like an arse. He started with models, which is just kind of strange, really. He also had a very, very wealthy family who farmed chickens. So Adrian Campos was the chicken man. In 1987, he paid his way into racing and basically had 3 efforts. He failed to qualify 3 times, I think it was. He crashed twice, and once he ran out of fuel. I heard a rumour, which may or may not make the edit, disclaimer, that he phoned in sick. He was just done with it. So that was the end of it. To his credit, he then later managed a 6th place at Jarama, but he was black flagged before the race even started because he took his helmet off to fit his earplugs, and of course you can't take your helmet off on the grid, so he was black flagged and off before he was done. Of the 21 races, he didn't finish or didn't qualify for all bar 2. In one of them he was last, in the other one I think he was last but one. So Chicky Man's results were, wait for the terrible joke, foul. That's Adrian Campos. Another reason for making these films is that I actually quite like to meet some of these people. Just if some of their magic will rub off on me, if some of their magical swagger or ability to blag their way into a hot drive relates to my amateur efforts in endurance racing, then I'll be very happy indeed. So next we're going to jump to Belgium and a chap called Philippe Adams. Now in 1988 he came a 31st in the European Lotus Opel Championship. That's so tenuous, I'm even struggling to understand what it is. But he was 31st, right? And I don't know how many people entered, but he was 31st. Around the same time, bailiffs for a financial company came and seized his family car because he couldn't keep up repayments on a Nissan. So when you go from that to 1991, he entered one Formula 3000 race and didn't qualify. And after that, he went to Lotus in 94. Now, proper motorsport fans will know that Lotus were really in the poop by 94. And their F1, their wonderful star-spangled F1 record was really coming to a shuddering halt. But he told Lotus in 94 that he had $500,000 in sponsorship to his name. So Zanardi, who was driving for them, got the boot. Now his only racing career was finishing 31st in some Formula Obscure. I don't even know what it is, right? It might even be one of those series for cars that Lotus of Engineering have tinkered in, like, you know, the Isuzu Bighorn Off-Road Cup or something. So it's tenuous, right? And one woeful attempt to get into F3000, which is, you know, great racing, but come on, it's not F1. So why Lotus believed he had $500,000 in 94, I don't know. But they did. So they kicked out Zanardi, who was a perfectly good driver and shouldn't be mentioned in any of the context in this entire film, and gave Philippe Adams the seat. Now, other sponsors were so concerned, not about Lotus, but about Adams, that they insisted that their logos be removed from the Lotus car. So he had like this plague effect where he got in and everybody just scarpered. So what happened? He did 15 laps and span off. I haven't done one lap in an F1 car. In fact, I don't think I've done much more than a couple of laps in any single seater because it's bloody difficult. So I'd like to meet Philippe Adams and just work out how the hell did he get so far in such a famous team when you are quite clearly not worth a bean and also perhaps not cut out to be a racing driver. Philippe Adams, call me. Let's have a cup of tea. Next up, Paul Belmondo. Sounds like a house DJ, doesn't it? Let me hear you make some noise, right at the ham. It's Paul Belmondo. In 1981, Paul Belmondo was rumoured to be the lover of Princess Stephanie of Monaco. So the reason I'm being rude about it is I'm just jealous. In 1994, he drove for Pacific, and this is a great example of a team that were not great, and therefore whoever sits in there isn't going to do fantastic, especially not house DJs called Paul Belmondo. You're going to have to cut that. I've got the giggles. In his 14 races, 14 races, he didn't qualify, and in 2 races, he didn't finish. Now, just to sum it up, now I've been rude about him, he came something like 3rd or 4th in class at the 24 Hour of Le Mans in 2005. I would argue that endurance racing is even tougher than F1, right? It's just tough. So the fact that he's done that means he's actually a pretty good driver. He drove for a rubbish team. I have images of some Euro house DJ in my head. That's why he makes the list. We'll talk about next a name that many will know, and there have been films made about him and interviews and books written and stuff. And he's quite a serious chap because he drove for Ferrari, and that's also the reason he's on this list. So we're going to talk about Luca Badoa. You know, if you put a gum shield in and you say Luca Badoa, it sounds like you're saying, look how bad you are. And I think this is another reason I've put him on my list. It's so thoroughly researched. So He won the 100cc karting championship in Italy in 1988. So he had a kind of conventional start. Italian karting championship at local level was pretty good. He then went to F3, and his big break was in 1992. He won the Formula 3000 championship. Now this is a big deal, right? This is credible, solid steps into single seat racing. Then he went into F1. He drove for Lola, Minardi, Forti, and back to Minardi, and he never scored a single point. And his best place, I think, was a 7th in San Marino in 93. My memory is awful, but I don't think many cars finished that race. So he didn't score points, because back then you didn't get points for finishing 7th. So he never scored a point in that. The reason he's on this list is what happened in 1999. I'm going to take a slurp of coffee. Sorry, this is really bad for continuity. Can I do this really noisy fashion? It really amuses me to do that. So in 1999, he was called up to Ferrari to be their test driver. Native Italian, lots of different forms of motorsport. It's kind of a solid guide to test your car. But by 2009, Felipe Massa had that awful injury where a component came off the car in front, smacked him in the chops, and the poor chap was out for quite some time. So Dodo was kind of catapulted into a seat in F1 in Ferrari. And he hadn't raced in a decade, and this is 2009 this happened. So the reason he's on this list is he drove for arguably the biggest name in F1 history and never scored a point. Now he had 50 races in F1 in total, and he raced, and I don't remember, but something like 2,364 laps in F1 without scoring a single point. Now I can understand when you're racing for people like Minardi why that might be difficult, but Ferrari, when you've got the whole team behind and you've been their test driver for years. Now he blamed the media. I've kind of dug beneath the surface to try and understand why this is. Well, like, what makes a good racing driver? Man, that's a whole different topic in itself. And he just blames the media. So you can kind of blame me, I suppose, if that's the case. So I'm at fault for look how bad you are, being a fairly average F1 driver. I don't think I want a coffee with him, because I think he'd probably punch me. Enrico Bonaldi is next on the list. In the 2001 Monaco Grand Prix, he famously held up David Coulthard for 35 laps. The commentators were screaming at him, the fans were screaming at him, and I'm damn sure that Coulthard, probably in them tight white jeans that he likes to wear, was screaming at him to get out of the way as well, because he held him up for 35 laps. Now, a lot of people point to that as evidence that Bonaldi was perhaps not a great Formula One driver, but I would say two things. Number one, it's not easy to overtake at Monaco, right? And number two, if Coulthard was any good, he should have just bloody overtaken him, right? You've got a name that pretty much nobody's ever heard of versus Coulthard in a top flight car. And besides, he didn't want to be a Formula One driver originally. He wanted to be a jockey. So, you know, he wanted to be on horseback, not in a car. So maybe we can take him off this list, because I don't think Bonaldi deserves his place. But anyway, that's the story of Bonaldi. Taki Inoue. You've all seen the footage of him being run over. I'm going to get to that in a moment. In 1994, in his debut in a Simtek, he managed just 3 laps before he crashed out, which isn't a great start. That alone isn't enough to put him on this list. I think we'll probably just cut to the chase with this one. I believe it was a Hungarian Grand Prix. He was driving for Footwork. That was it. He was driving for Footwork. Horrible backmarker of a car. I love the backmarkers, by the way. In a Formula One race, I'm looking at the last 5 or 6 as opposed to the leading dozen. That's where I get my kicks. Maybe I'm strange. So I was following the Footwork, and what happened was the car gave up and then caught fire. Now, Inoue is a very conscientious chap, so he jumped out, he commandeered a fire extinguisher from a marshal and tried to put his car out. And as he was kind of running to the car to do that, he was hit by a safety car, a course car, which knocked him over. I read somewhere that he broke his leg. I don't know if he did break his leg or not, but it's quite amusing watching him hop on one leg trying to extinguish a very barbecued car. There's another incident as well with him. So in Monaco, during practice once, he broke down in his car. I don't know if that was a Footwork or something else. And for whatever reason, in practice, they decided to tow the F1 car back to the pits using a Renault Clio. All right, I'm not in charge of the rules. I don't know why they did that. So they've hooked up Taki Inoue's F1 car with him in it to a Clio, and he managed to roll the car somehow. I don't know if footage of this exists. I don't know how I don't know. I just don't know. How do you do it? I mean, I understand physics and I understand gravity and I understand grip, but how you roll a Formula One car when you're being towed by a Clio around somewhere hilly like Monaco is beyond me. So it's kind of for scrapes like that he makes this. And also because, let's be honest, we're more interested in the more obscure drivers here. You've probably heard some of the stories like Inouye and others perhaps before, but another reason he's on here is he's very active on Twitter, or KISS as it's now called, or X or whatever. I don't know, I've binned off my social media. He is very opinionated and he's quite right-wing, it would seem, as well. Now, I don't know whether he's doing this ironically or if he genuinely is concerned about the growth of certain religions in European cities or not, but it makes a very entertaining, if somewhat misguided, reading. So that's the story of Taki Inouye. I'm pretty sure we might get a response out of him when he sees this, so we'll have a glass of sake together and he can tell me what's wrong with the state of Birmingham. Ricardo Rosset Tosser. So Tosser was what his own mechanics spelled using the letters that spell his surname on his paddock scooter because they were fed up of him whinging about the state of his car. And they might have been quite unkind mechanics, but you don't fall out with your team is the first rule in F1 because they can make or break it, just like James in the edit, okay? I think if I've upset him today, he's going to make me look like a bigger arse than I normally do. But Ricardo Rosset pissed everybody off, and so they vandalised his scooter. And it wasn't that bad. He was driving a MasterCard Lola, which was famously one of the worst F1 cars ever, perhaps behind the Life car, which is a story in itself. Go and check that one out. What he said was, making a driver look stupid is more lucrative than discovering the truth, which is like a really powerful wow kind of thing. And what he also said was, what people say don't bother me. So if it doesn't bother you, mate, you were rubbish at it. He now runs a clothing company in Brazil. He's probably not a tosser. He's probably a really nice guy. But hey, he was a hopeless, hopeless guy in F1. It's 1993 and Marco Apicella, I believe I pronounced that correctly, had signed for Jordan. And he only made it to the first corner before being hit by JJ Lehto's car, or possibly hitting JJ Lehto's car, at which point he was out. He never raced in F1 again, so he qualified 23rd out of 26 drivers, did 800 metres and was never seen again. I think that's a fairly compelling case to put him on a list of hopeless drivers. I will also say those 23 out of 26, he did qualify higher than Luca Badoa. So, you know, all fingers are pointed at you now, Luca. We're now into 2006. I did say we're going to jump around chronologically here, and with Super Aguri and a Japanese driver, because Japanese team favour Japanese drivers, is a logical thing to do, and Yuji Ide. The problem with Yuji was that he was probably one of the world's oldest rookies, aged 31 in 2006 when he started racing, so there's hope for me yet, even though I'm probably old enough to be his dad, technically speaking. He didn't speak any English. And I don't speak any Japanese, so I can't be cruel about him for that. But it meant that he couldn't communicate with his team at all. They later found out that he'd only ever done 200 kilometres of testing in an F1 car before they actually put him into a race. So he had 3 retirements and 1 13th place, and he was then replaced by somebody else. He then got back into touring car and other single-seat racing back in Japan and was actually pretty good. So I think this is a case of the culture killed his F1 career as opposed to his lack of ability, but still, he was pretty hopeless in F1, so that's why he's on the list. We're going to jump to Canada now and a chap called Al Pease. Al Pease, I think, was actually born in Darlington, so before all the... they're called Canucks Canadians? I forget the nickname for Canadians now. Anywho, before the Canadians pipe up and say that's not fair, I'm going to take the mickey out of him because he's kind of from the same area as me in the UK. But anyway, World War II veteran, got into racing. He bought something called an Eagle Climax. And in his home Grand Prix in the 1969 Canadian Grand Prix, he was black flagged for simply being too slow. Jackie Stewart and others were being held up, and basically the team principals went to race control and said, this guy is a liability. You've got to get him off the track. He's so slow. Now, I don't think being slow is a reason to kick somebody out of a race. I think as long as you're safe and your car is safe and you're going round and round, then you shouldn't be black flagged. But it must have been pretty humiliating for him. On the flip side, he was one of the first names to be inaugurated into the Canadian Motorsports Hall of Fame. So I don't know whether they're doing that ironically or whether he was actually genuinely brilliant in other races or not. Or maybe they're doing it to defend his honour. Maybe that's it. So yeah, Canadian honour defended. That's the story of Alpes and his 1969 black flag for just being too slow. Csánok Nissany doesn't mean he's like a Nissan, that's his name. We're at the 2005 Hungarian Grand Prix, and somebody that treated motorsport as a hobby, which probably it should be for the majority of people, managed to get a paid seat to join practice at the Hungarian Grand Prix, which is actually pretty impressive. He was well off the pace, of course, and he probably didn't care because it, fulfilling a dream in F1. Now, he had like weird levels of support. To this day, people are very defensive of his honour. And I think he has a son that races as well. I might look into that later. But I'd like to meet Csánok Nissany. Now, he span off because he said the car had too much grip. And even me as an amateur, grip and spinning, these are things that perhaps don't go together. And because he was so unfamiliar in a Formula One car, he couldn't, after he spun, he couldn't get the steering wheel off, even though it spun anyway, he couldn't get the steering wheel off. So he had the humiliation of being craned off the circuit after having spun while still sat in the car. And that's like the world's focus is on you. The world's surely better to go out in a fireball than the humiliation of being craned off while still sat in the car. That's the story of Csánok Nissany. It's 1992. We are with a Swiss driver called Andrea Chiesa, and he was in a hopeless Fond Metal car. Fond Metal was a company that made alloy wheels, a bit like ATS, and for some reason they thought that getting into F1 would be a great way to promote their wheels. I don't think it was when you got drivers like this, because he had 7 did not qualify and 3 did not finish. He was still better than Delatraz, who we're going to get onto in a second, and also better than fellow Swiss Gregor Wojtek, who just had a colossal string of did not qualify. But at least he had a go. Andrea Chiesa, hopeless, but it was a hopeless car. 1981, in an Ensign, which was, again, a backmarker car, there was a fellow whose name is supposedly Ricardo Londono-Bridge. I don't think his name was London Bridge. I think he's made that up. And the reason I think he's made that up is in 81, in the Colombian Grand Prix, he was the first Colombian to take part in F1. So he had a huge following, and he was all set to make his debut at practice. A lot of fanfare, a lot of news in the press, when Bernie Eccleston checked through the paperwork, allegedly, supposedly, and discovered that his 2 biggest sponsors were the National Coffee Bean Growers Association of Colombia, it's plausible, and a Mr. P. Escobar. And I think Mr. P. Escobar was probably into naughty stuff that shouldn't appear on an F1 car. So he was somehow de-invited or didn't turn up. So on one hand, Colombia's first F1 driver, on the other hand, made up name, and now they say that you can't slander the dead, so I can say that because he is dead. He was murdered in a hotel in a drugs deal after having been a salesman selling speedboats to the cartel in order for them to smuggle drugs. A hell of a guy. I would love to research his life and make a book on it. I'll almost certainly be shot and murderized if I went anywhere near it. Ricardo Londono-Bridge, I salute you wherever you are in the heavens. Now to the Netherlands. No more house DJ impressions, to a chap called Huub Rottengatter. Probably got that wrong, don't care. He was hopeless. But he did make 25 starts in Formula One, which is like kind of okay. And this is in the mid-1980s. The reason he's on here is to provoke a little bit of lively debate, because after his fairly anonymous career or season in F1 with many not finishes, he went on to manage a guy called Jos Verstappen. And Jos Verstappen is famous for basically being set fire to in his F1 car because they removed the safety filters from the fueling thing, kaboom. And also Verstappen, yep, that's right, he's Max Verstappen's dad. So he might have been a fairly average F1 driver. Can we say rubbish? Is that unkind? But he did sort of indirectly invent the world's most robotic and merciless F1 driver, that is Max Verstappen. So hero or villain, I'm not entirely sure, but I think he deserves to go on the list. That's Rottengatter. Roelofs Wunderlink. Sounds like I've been drinking, doesn't it? Roelofs Wunderlink. That's a brilliant name. I wish I was called Wunderlink. He had 6 attempts at F1. I believe this was in an Ensign, and he qualified on 3 occasions, retiring from retiring from 2 and finishing in Austria, but he was so far off the pace, he was not classified. This is like such a distinctive name and yet such a totally anonymous F1 career that he makes the cut. I'd like to think that today he operates a BMW independent repair specialist somewhere near Vienna. I don't know why I think that. Rolioff, reach out to us, man, talk to us. In 1994, the Larousse Formula One team needed a pay driver, and they found a Swiss chap called Jean-Denis Delatraz. I'm going to put my cards on the table now. I follow Delatraz on Instagram, and I'm just jealous of his lifestyle because he appears to do stuff all other than swank around in really fancy cars in nice places. So that's partially the reason he's on the list. He arrived at Larousse, but prior to that, he'd spent, I think, 4 years in Formula F3000 and only scored 8 points in 4 years. This is terrible. He shouldn't have been let anywhere near a Larousse Formula One car or anything else. So in his first race in Australia, he was 3 seconds off the pace of a Japanese chap called Dodo, who's also pretty hopeless and doesn't make this list, but whatever. By the time he conked out on the 56th lap, he'd been lapped, I think, 10 or 12 times by the leaders. He was just like absolutely way off. Jonathan Palmer, the BBC commentator at the time, says Delatraz has absolutely no place in Formula One. I think that's pretty rude, right? Because I think if you've paid for your ride and you've blagged it and you've winged it, and maybe Palmer was jealous, I don't know. Maybe he is jealous, and maybe I'm jealous of him because he owns Bedford Aerodrome and was actually quite successful. But anyway, that's the story of him. In '95, however, the Pacific team were broke and invited him back. Like, how could they not have learned their lesson? So they said, we will work very hard together to make the end of the season a great success. And like, you know, a PR person has written that because any sane person, and certainly any of the mechanics would have said, this guy's hopeless, this car's bust, can we get paid please? What are we doing kipping in a van trying to fix this death trap? Because he was absolutely hopeless. So during qualifying, he stalled right on the racing line during qualifying. And I think he did 13 seconds a lap slower to Coulthard. And he didn't finish, and I've read this, and you can be sued by the living, so I'll pick my words carefully. I think he packed in because he said, my arms are aching. Now, I've got office boy arms, right? Like, I'm no beefcake. It was bloody hard to drive a Formula One car, but come on, man. If you can't handle the steering wheel, then what are you? That's why Delatraz is on here, not just because I'm jealous of him. Nobody, I think, beyond the weirdest F1 nerds and geeks will have heard of Leslie Johnson. Hands up if you heard of Leslie Johnson. I'm going to pretend I've got an audience. Nobody's heard of Leslie Johnson. In the first World Championship F1 Grand Prix held at Silverstone in 1950, Leslie Johnson was the first to not finish. So he did 2 laps in F1 before his car conked out. Now, that might seem like I'm kind of picking on him for that, and maybe I am, but he never returned to F1. And he had every opportunity, because back then, gentlemen racers with a few could get into F1, and there was starting to be some focus on it. It was a worthwhile thing, and it was a worthy reward for his life. Now, another reason I feel slightly bad, I never feel bad picking on Delatraz because he's a flash git, whereas Leslie Johnson was a working class Londoner from Walthamstow, I believe, who inherited the family cabinet furniture making business when his parents passed away prematurely. And he was famous for being a very, very generous employer at a time when there was a lot of unemployment, very, very hard times, the war and all the rest of it. And he basically looked after his employees from cradle to grave. So he really looked after his employees. He paid them well. The business became a success because his employees were invested in what they were doing. A real model company, a really fantastic guy who looked after people. And his reward to himself was a seat in Formula One, which is fantastic. But he didn't return. Like, we're at least half a century on, and I won't name the date so it doesn't date the film, but, you know, we're all like 3/4 of a century on from that, and he never went back to F1. Now, he must have enjoyed it, right? You'd done 2 laps. It would have been absolutely thrilling. He had the money to do it, and he didn't go back. So that kind of points to him in a perverse formula that I've got in my head of being the least successful Formula One driver ever. It also is perhaps a good one to wrap this up on, because he was also, from what I can see, and of course I never met him, one of the nicest people out. And he had a couple of unpronounceable, dreadful ailments that sent him to an early grave. So I kind of feel bad picking on him, and I'm also pretty sure that Leslie Johnson, amongst the Bentley Boys era of people, that name would mean something and they'd remember him very fondly. So yeah, Leslie Johnson might be perhaps the unluckiest or least successful F1 driver ever, having had the chance to put it right, but he's probably one of the nicest people ever. So there we go. I think I've rattled through 22 names, and I'm damn sure I've made quite a few mistakes in this as well. So I'm very happy to be corrected, insulted. The glass is new. I'm getting old. Talk to me. I'd like to know more about these people. If the FBI's drug handling agent who once looked after Ricardo Londono-Bridge, if that's his name, is watching, talk to me, because I would absolutely love to come to Colombia and learn more about him. If Delatraz is around, I know I've called you a bit of an arse. Please come and go and have a drink sometime, because I just want to borrow your cars and your life looks amazing. Ricardo Rossi, I'm sorry for calling you a tosser, but I'm a working class guy that's probably going to side with the mechanics, so maybe I'm not quite so sorry for that. But that's my shortlist. I'd love to know more about these people. I think these people are way more interesting than the Red Bull, for sure the team did good, all support the people, let's do ethical shit. Because as important that it is, it's also so dull. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed watching.